Hey folks, so this is the Unit 2 introduction, pretty simple. In Unit 2, we are going to be listening to the BBC, they call it an eco-thriller called Forest 404, kind of like the Air Forest 404, like 404 Air Online. So anyway, the premise of it is that it is a futuristic world in which the main character is kind of like a librarian, but her job is to like throw shit away, all right? And so she's like trashing sound files. And she's pretty good at her job until she comes across this sound that she has never heard before. And it is the sound of a rainforest. And she doesn't know what she's listening to because in this particular moment, forests don't exist. Animals don't exist. They're gone, which is really fucking sad. So that's the premise of this, and that's the premise from which all the action starts. Okay, so that's Forest 404. It is a brilliant, it's actually one of the best audio dramas I think I've ever listened to. So it's really neat. The other thing that's super neat about it is that I think they're like, I'm pretty sure there are like 9 or 10 parts to it, but the neat thing is that each part actually has 3 parts to it. There's like the part that's like the drama itself, like the interaction between the characters. But then after that, there's like this mini talk that's like a nonfiction micro talk. Like imagine like a TED talk, but environmentalist, but like actually really neat and immediately connects to what whatever the previous episode was. And then after that, a soundscape. And you might be thinking, oh, I should totally just skip the talk and the soundscape. Don't. It makes such a huge difference. It's just really profound how creative the podcast is put together, but the way that those 3 pieces really weave together to help enhance your meaning, the meaning of the story itself. So there's that. So that's just a little bit about Forest 404. There are 2 theories that we're going to be working with in this unit, and that is ecocriticism and then also posthumanism, right? So ecocriticism is pretty much what you would expect, right? In the sense that it's really going to be talking about, it's not just like, oh, climate change is happening, but the idea is like, how is it happening? How does this sort of impact societies? How does it understand how we perceive the world, right? So there is a term that is going to be used in the piece and that you're going to be seeing a lot, which is like the Anthropocene. And if you are like a geologist or whatever, if you know someone and you're like, oh, gee, Pat, you're saying that wrong. F me, I'm not a geographer, right? So anyway, the idea is that this is basically a period, the current geological period of time that we exist in, which is really kind of gutting and depressing because it's basically talking about how we're kind of living in a moment in which of like environmental devastation that is on the precipice of like mass extinction, like that's what the Anthropocene is, right? So when you see people mention that term, that is what they're talking about in ecocriticism. Okay, so there's that. The other piece that we're going to be talking about is posthumanism. So posthumanism is really interesting in the sense that, how do I explain this? So in humanism, and humanism is great. So I don't want you to think that that like there's this sort of progression where everything that's humanist is old, and that's not how this goes. But humanism basically has like the human being as like the center of all of its theories, and that's super duper fine, right? But posthumanism is basically like the human being can no longer be, it's sort of like in a response to this moment that we're in. And it's basically like the human being can no longer sort of be like the center of how we are like building knowledge and relationships. So how we're constructing reality can't simply be centered around the human being, that it needs to be more expansive than that to include other animals, environments, or even objects. So that's posthumanism, right? In a nutshell. But here's a fun little fact to know about posthumanism. So this kind of goes back to sort of, how do I put this? Yeah, this kind of links back to theories that we're going to be addressing in a future unit, but specifically decolonial theory, but also colonial theory. So here's the thing, all right? So a lot of what decolonial theory and also post-colonial theory is talking about are the ways in which so much of how the world has been theorized in academic theories is really centered around the West and a really kind of a white Western perspective, right? And that is really fundamentally flawed for like so many reasons, right? But this is a thing to know, is like during the period of colonization, one of the things that made colonialism so violent wasn't just that they're just like, you know, rolling up on another person's like country and culture and then like being like, this is ours now and we're going to steal your shit and subjugate you and then tell you that you're nothing. But on top of that, one of the ways that they did that was by basically positioning the West as like always already enlightened. And so they knew all the shit and everyone else's society was like super duper backwards, right? Now you might be thinking, why in the hell am I telling you this in a unit about posthumanism? I'll explain in a second. So when the West is sort of dogging on these, on like other cosmologies, ways in which the world, that folks perceive how the world is ordered, right? You know, the West is like, oh, we're so modern and enlightened and all this. And they're like, hey, F your sort of cosmology in which you see yourself as connected to the land and having some sort of reciprocal relationship with other creatures, right? And in perceiving, you know, the soil and the rocks around you as alive, right? That's just crazy, right? That's just backwards. And you know, there was a sort of theory called animism, which was basically like, oh, look at these backward societies that sort of believe in relationships with animals and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's like a colonial violence to be like, hey, the way that you pictured the world is like not only wrong, but fundamentally flawed, and therefore is the reason why we're going to steal your shit and subjugate you, right? So why am I mentioning this in a unit about posthumanism? Because posthumanism, as I just mentioned, is this idea of human cannot be like the center of the universe, right? And so like you have to see how the human is connected to like other animals and other like parts of nature and other objects, right? So that's what posthumanism is about, right? It's just like this idea that the human can't be the center. So what does that look a lot like? It looks a lot like post-colonial theory and decolonial theory, right? And so there is this way in which there's a bit of a critique that's like, hey, cool story, bro, but you're really just kind of pilfering from decolonial and colonial thought and stealing our shit, right? So you're going to kind of notice that come up in some of the pieces that we're going to be reading. So I did want to mention, I did a little edit there because I rambled for a second. So here's what I wanted to mention. For Unit 2, I had a nerdy moment in which I really couldn't pick between the things I wanted you to read the most. And so there are 4 equally amazing readings that you can pick from, and you only have to pick 2. Okay, so let me explain what they are. So remember that, again, posthumanism and then also environmentalism. So let's start with posthumanism. There are 2. There's Watts's indigenous place thought and agency among humans and non-humans. So in this reading, this is kind of like that mixture of decolonial and post-colonial thought. So it's really kind of got into that relationship between the human, decentering the human, and kind of foregrounding and figuring out how the human is always in a reciprocal relationship with the land, with every aspect, with creatures around them, right? So that there's, and it's actually a really lovely piece. Then related to that, there's the next piece on the human nature, offspring, indigenous thoughts on post-human heritage. So this is where we're actually seeing a decolonial critique of posthumanism, even as the author is using it. The neat thing about this one, though, is that it's actually talking about trees. And so that is really kind of neat. And trees are important. Let's just put it that way. And forests 4-4. But both of them are delightful. So when we're talking about eco-criticism, there are two other ones. So there's on the importance of a date and decolonizing the Anthropocene, right? And remember, I told you what the Anthropocene was, right? So that one's actually kind of cool because it's like, hey, the moment in which we dated the Anthropocene, I think is like 1950s, and they're like, nah, nice try, buddy. We actually need to like, you know, kind of throw it in reverse and start the Anthropocene at the moment of like when all these like colonizations start happening, because that's the moment in which the environment starts to get devastated, is from the moment of colonization, right? Which is actually a really brilliant and also very important and political argument. So there you're kind of seeing like decolonial thought kind of vibe with some eco-criticism. And you might be thinking, does this happen often? Yes, it does, because most academic theorists are never working from just like one critical perspective when they're writing. It just doesn't happen that way. Usually we find you know, 2 or 3, sometimes 4 that we're vibing with as we are, you know, interpreting the world around us, right? And that just sort of becomes our sort of signature. So it's not surprising that you're seeing these sort of overlaps. And then the last one, living environmentalisms. So this one is actually kind of neat because it is a blending of eco-criticism and feminism, where it's basically talking about this idea of like reproductive freedom, but not in the way of, I mean, yeah, like absolutely people who can become pregnant should be able to, you know, do whatever the F they want with their body. That's just, you know, being human, right? Being able to have agency over your body. But this is actually talking about expanding and exploding that notion of reproductive freedom to talk about social reproduction, and this idea of like being able to, we should also be able to have the right to raise our families however we conceive of those families in an environment that is like non-toxic, that is safe, that is, you know, all these different things. And so that is really kind of cool too, right? So the idea here is that you've got 4 really awesome articles to pick from. You only have to pick 2. And, you know, just sort of keep that in mind in a choose your own adventure. I will always read and comment on all of them. So yeah, that's kind of the deal, friends. And the neat thing is that when we start like doing those like flash analyses, you're going to have some really cool sort of overlaps. So just keep that in mind as you're doing the active reading exercise, that depending, you may not necessarily have as many people to comment with. So yeah, but I'm always going to be in there no matter what. So I'll be there to talk to. So they're good pieces.